Welcome again to the complete free Flutter course right here on YouTube, presented by yours truly, Ovidiu Mazuru. Today we're going to go over Module 1, Lesson 9. We're going to study some of the more advanced list functions, some of the functions which you'll probably use most often, and the ones which might not be quite as obvious as some of the others. For example, if I teach you list.first, it's pretty obvious what that does. So let's start this lesson by just giving ourselves a couple lists. So let's say we have a list of int, my list equals, and we'll just give it some numbers. And we can also have a list of strings, days of the week, and just write out the days, Monday, Tuesday. So nothing out of the ordinary so far. And by the way, if you're wondering how I did that, on VS Code, at least on my one, it's Control, Shift, and I. What that's going to do is format everything for us automatically. So for example, a long line like this, if I hit, and I'll type it here, Control, Shift, I, all at the same time, it will be formatted on multiple lines of code like this instead. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are some which are just quite simple, like my list.first. We won't spend much time on this. If I just put a print around this, it's going to do exactly what you would think. So dot v9. It will just give me the first element. And the same way with my list dot last, it's going to give me the last element. The first main function we'll go over today is forEach. So what forEach does is it simplifies looping over each element of a list. In other words, it lets us do something for each element of a list. So if I say my list.forEach, like this, and then inside, so it's list.forEach, inside I can have some kind of function. And the function can be an arrow function or a longer function, they're both fine. The function is going to take some kind of input, which we can call anything we'd like. Normally you'll see it called things like item, element. In this case I'll call it n because my list here is a list of numbers and n is a common shorthand for number. And we could just do something like print n. So what this is going to do is loop over all of the elements in my list and print them out one at a time. As you can see, I'm using an arrow function, but I could use different types of functions as well. For example, I could say days of the week dot forEach, and here I could take day like this. So it's a long form function. I could say if, let's say day 0 equals t, for example, then we can print the day. So you might not have seen this before. We can use this on strings, also on lists, and it gives us the elements at position I. So in this case, day 0 will give us the first element in the day. So if we go to, these are our days, and the first element is going to be m, t, and so on. So if that first element is t, we're going to print the day, and if not, we won't do anything. So what this will do is print Tuesday and Thursday, as we can see here, but it's not going to print out any of the other days. Also in this line, we can see it printed out all the numbers one by one as we expected. Now you might be curious why we can do this for lists as well as strings. I won't go into too much detail, but basically strings and lists are cousins. In some languages like C, a string is a type of list. In C, a string is an array of characters. And in Dart, it's not exactly the same. A string is what we call a pattern, and a list is an iterable. But they are related and they do have a lot in common. We can easily convert from one to the other. For example, if we had string str equals whatever, then we could say str.split, and we'll split on nothing. What this will do is split the string on the character which we specified. And on this case, since we didn't specify any character, it'll split on every character. So this is going to give us back, it says a list of strings where each string is going to be one character. So if I did want to print this out, and let's just comment these out for now. You can see for some reason I typed home instead of print. I'm not sure why I did that. But you can see it prints out the list with the square brackets of each character one at a time. Similarly, we can do it the other way around. If we had, for example, if I take days of the week, I could say print days of the week dot join. And what this is going to do is the opposite of split. Join will join a list of strings and return a single string. If we put our mouse over it, we can see it has a return type of string, and it takes string separator. Notice that separator word coming up again, same as here. It's a split of pattern. Patterns and separators are similar. I'm not going to go into too much detail now. They're related to strings, but they're not. They're related to lists, but they're not the same. And you can see if we do that join, it gives us a single string with all of these with nothing in between. I could also join on an empty space, for example. And now it's going to join them, but it will put whatever I have in between the brackets between the string, which makes it look much nicer. So all of that is great, but what I'm really trying to point out is simply that we can use the square bracket notation on the lists and on the strings, and that strings and lists are related but not exactly the same. And on additionally to that, it's just remember to use the forEach function, which I have here. And then the next function we'll learn is map. So map is really similar to forEach. The main difference is forEach simply loops over our list, whereas map loops over, does something, and returns a new list. Let's make a list of strings, and we'll say converted int equals, and we can take my list. That was the original list with just the numbers, and we can use, first let's see what happens if we try to use forEach. Take n, and then let's just say n to string. So that will take n and turn it into a string. We can see if we try to do this, it gives us an error. It says this expression has a type of void, so its value can't be used. And in fact, over here we'll see there's a return type of void on the forEach function. So when I try to say converted int equals my list of forEach, well, Dart says, hey, I'm not returning anything, so I can't put converted int equal to my list of forEach. That doesn't make sense. But what does make sense is if we change this into map, because map will do almost the same thing, except it returns the new list. And if we put our mouse over here again, notice it says it has a return type of iterable t, which is interesting because I have list of string. So let's see what happens. It will, as expected, give me an error. Specifically, it says type map list iterable in string is not a subtype of type list string. So a list, it's the grandchild of an iterable, and map is giving us back an iterable. So while they are related, they're not exactly the same. And for me to switch to a list, all I have to do is add .toList at the end. And by saving it and running it again, I have no outputs because I didn't print it out, but there was no error, so that's a good sign. So if I print it out this time, it's going to give me, it looks exactly the same. The difference is this list was a list of ints, and now this list is the same list but as a string. So if you need to do that, that could be useful, but if not, it's still useful to know. Another thing I want to show you guys is that we can also declare a function outside of the map or fold or anything like that, and we'll go over fold later. I could say something like int square num, which can take an int I, and then I could just return I times I. So here I have a small function, it just returns the square of whatever its input is, and I can say list of int squared ints equals mylist again, map, and instead of writing out the function like I did over here or above, I can just say map and use the square num, and then I'm going to have to say toList at the end like I did before. Save it, and we won't get, in fact we get an error, which we shouldn't have because I missed the T there. And you can see we get this. And you can see we have no outputs because we haven't printed it out. But if we did print it out, you can see it went over all of our numbers and it just squared each one by one, and then gave us that returned, gave us a new list as return. One more thing I'd like you guys to notice is over here where I say square num, I do not have that open and close brackets because the function which map takes automatically is in this form. So automatically function open close, and it has some kind of input which is dynamic by default, which we can call element, and then it has the function body. So since the function has one input, whatever function I pass in must also have one input. However, I can choose which input type I want. I can have an int, a string, a dynamic. That's all perfectly fine. But I do have to have just one input. If I try to use int y as well here, get rid of this, then this would end up giving me an error. Notice if I put my mouse over it, it says the argument type int function int can't be assigned to the parameter type dynamic function int, right? So because my list has only int in the input, Dart is smart enough to know that each element it's going to give me is going to be an int, and there's only one, right? So I can't use int I, int y, doesn't make sense. But if I just remove this, that's going to be perfectly fine, and it will do exactly what we expect it to do. There are a couple more functions I want to show you guys. Next one is going to be where. What where will do is, well, it's the same as filter in many other languages. It will return the element if the element meets a condition, or if a condition returns true, and if it doesn't, it won't return the element. So I could say list int filtered int equals mylist dot where, and I won't use mylist, in fact I'll use square int dot where, and then you're going to have some kind of condition here. So I'll put my function again, n, which is going to take each element, and we'll say if n is greater than 10, then go ahead and give me that thing back. If it isn't, ignore it. And here, if we decide to print this out and get rid of this so I don't see the output, you can see I have an error because I forgot to say toList. And if I do it again, it's going to give me just those numbers, those elements, which meet this condition, and it's going to ignore everything before it. So just two more functions I want to go over, and these two are quite similar. We have reduce and fold. So reduce and fold both take the list and return a single element. It kind of combines them through a function we give it. The main difference is that when using fold, we can give it an initial value, whereas when using reduce, we can't. So if I wanted to get the sum, for example, I could say int sum equals and then take mylist dot reduce. And now reduce is going to take a slightly different type of function than the others. It's going to take value and elements. The reason it does this is because elements represents, our n over here, or I, whatever we want to call it, and value is the value of the previous elements combined. So we can just write value plus n. What this does is, so first time the value will be empty, reduce is going to be the first element we have, which is going to be 1. So we have 1 here by itself. That's our starting element. And then on the next loop through, value is the previous element after this, which is going to be 1 still. And then we're going to have that previous element plus whatever comes next. So what comes next is going to be the 2. So then we're going to get 3 as the result of this. 3 is then plugged into value here. So value now is 3. And we add the next element in the list, which is going to be also 3 coincidentally. And then 3 plus 3 is going to be 6. Then we're going to take this 6, plug it back into value, then value plus the next element, which now is going to be 4, is going to be 10, and so on. So then if we print the sum, and I can't even remember how many elements I had in this list, we're going to get 21, because I did have that 6 at the end. And let's just get rid of this. So that is the reduce method. I'm sure you can tell it's pretty much the same as having a for loop, in which we're adding all of the items to the sum, or we can do any other kind of function. And finally, we could do a similar thing, folded sum, with with fold. So we can see fold takes the initial value, and then a previous value and an element. So this is going to be the same as this. The difference is we can actually set an initial value. So if I just copy this, and here I called it value, and here I called it n, I could set, for example, 0. If I set 0, it's going to give me exactly the same result as sum. If we print this out, we can see they're the same. But if I gave it a different value, we can see now this is going to update. And you might see this and think, well, why would we want to do that? When we're adding, folding with an initial value doesn't really make sense because we're probably going to start at 0. If I'm doing a division, for example, I don't want to start with the first element. Maybe I want to divide like some huge number by all my things in all my elements in a list. I don't want to divide the first number by everything else. In fact, we could show that example. If I started with a big number and say value divided by n, and we use floor divide for the types, and then did the same thing here, we're going to see the, here we're going to get 0 because we start with 1 and then just divide it by everything. So we end up losing all of our numbers there. Whereas here, because we started with the big number, we end up with 13 at the end. So for something like division, a fold can make a lot of sense where a reduce might not make sense. But at the same time, if we don't need this initial value, it can be easier to just use reduce from the beginning. That's pretty much it for these more important list functions. So if I just comment all of this out so we can review everything. So we can see we started with 2 lists, my list with ints, my list with strings, both perfectly fine. Then using a forEach, it allowed us to iterate over each element in the list one at a time and do something with it. We could either have an arrow function or a complete function, both were fine, and we could do whatever we wanted in the function body. Then we showed how we can get the elements at a certain position using the square bracket notation, and we can do that with strings as well as lists. Following this, we showed how strings and lists are related, and as a result, we can do something like string.split to turn our string into a list. At the same time, we can join a list either on nothing or on a character to get a string out of those lists. And then we looked at the map function. Map is similar to the forEach, the difference being that map is actually going to return something, whereas forEach doesn't return anything. So if I did want to save this output, I would need to use map rather than forEach. Next, we looked at how we can also pass in a function which we defined elsewhere, so we don't need to use these arrow functions like we kept doing. We also had a quick look at where. Where is also called filter in many languages, and essentially it just gives back the values that meet a certain condition but does not give back the values which fail that condition. And finally, we looked at reduce and fold, which do something similar in that they combine all the values in our list and reduce them to a single value. They do some kind of operation which we define here in this function and give us back a single value. The difference between the two is that with reduce, we're always going to start with our initial value being the first element in the list, whereas with fold, we can set an initial value and then all of our elements, we can do something to that initial value. So the case of division, reduce and fold is going to be really quite different, whereas in the case of addition, pretty much the same thing. I wouldn't worry too much about that. So guys, really quickly before we finish our exercise for next time, we're going to practice all of our list operations. I know there was no exercise last time, and that's because I wanted to combine it with this. This was a real question I saw on a Flutter Facebook group. So somebody asked how he can make a drop-down list showing these kind of numbers, 000, 0015, basically going by quarter of an hour for the entire day. So do this up until 23:45. And we haven't gone into drop downs yet. That's going to be more of a Flutter thing. But if you know how to make the initial list with just these numbers, turning it into the drop down is trivial afterwards. So what we're going to do in this exercise is make a list programmatically. Do not type them all out, which is going to print out all of these numbers starting at 0000 and going in increments of 15 minutes, then to 100 all the way until 23:45. And then we're going to store all of that in a list, or you can print them out like I did, so that when we do learn about Flutter, we can easily turn them into a drop down like this. Okay guys, so I'm really looking forward to the solutions you guys have to this exercise. I'm not sure if it's going to be the easiest, but I trust you guys can do it. So that's been it from me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next time. For now, myself, Avidius, I'm out.